It's always a pleasure to visit the Global Humanities Institute. I feel like we're in friendly territory for critical thinking, for promoting social justice, and I'm also very happy about the continuing bonds of solidarity between the Montgomery College community and our brothers and sisters in El Salvador. So what I wanted to do today is to give a talk about the historical context and draw attention to what's happening today with regard to El Salvador, because I think that gives some good indicators, some good background to those of you who are going to be visiting, maybe some for the first time. I also want to leave time for discussion so we can follow up on some of these ideas. So I have changed the title to US Exceptionalism and Democide, because I think in the case of El Salvador, these two concepts come into collision. So US exceptionalism is the idea that the United States is in the cutting edge of historical progress and leads the way in the world for democracy and freedom. And democide is what actually happened in El Salvador. Democide is murder by the state that was perpetrated in massive numbers and in ways that have left its mark on the people of El Salvador, including those in the diaspora who are among us in the Montgomery County area. So today I note with mixed feelings the 26th anniversary of the signing of a peace treaty between the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, the FMLN, and the right-wing US-backed government of El Salvador at the time that ended the 12-year civil war. On the one hand, the peace treaty ended the bloodshed that claimed more than 75,000 non-combatant lives. The peace treaty incorporated the FMLN into civilian and political life. It created a new civil police force from the ranks of soldiers and FMLN insurgents, and it dismantled the most ruthless elements of the security forces and brought them back to the barracks. But it left in place the very hierarchies of economic and social domination that were the root causes of the war in the first place. And during the first post-war administration of the Arena Party, the Assembly, which was dominated by Arena and other right-wing parties, gave themselves impunity by means of an amnesty law that has stayed in place up until recently. According to the UN Truth Commission report, which I know some of you have seen, they did a study of more than 22,000 cases, and they found that 85% of the murders committed during the war were committed by the US-backed security forces and their allied death squads. 5% they found were committed by the FMLN. This was a war in which the US invested $1 million a day in training, equipping, advising the perpetrators. Honduras, which still has the largest US military base in the region, and by the way, that's the base from which the democratically elected president of Honduras, Mel Zelaya, was flown out of the country in 2009. This military base was key during the war in El Salvador. And I'd like to mention in this regard the Rio Sample massacre, because this was a pincer operation in which refugees fleeing El Salvador, attempting to cross the river into Honduras, were met by Honduran soldiers on the other side. So they were fired upon by both sides, and about 600 people were killed. Now, those refugees that reached the US were not recognized as refugees. And so thousands were deported, including from the DC metropolitan area. The crisis, the violence was so severe and widespread that about 20% of the population was either displaced or fled the country. And this is really important when we consider that many of the youth that arrived here at the time were unaccompanied minors. So the theme for this brief presentation, Exceptionalism and Democide, it's meant to provide a context for those planning to visit, a very brief social, economic, historical context. Again, I take U.S. exceptionalism to be a continuation of European modernity that served as the ideology of the Spanish conquest of the Americas beginning in 1492. The Holy War waged against the original peoples and Africans brought as slaves was justified by a so-called civilizing mission in the name of Christianity, but not based on Christian values, which viewed the Indian as subhuman. The Eurocentric view of history was one in which progress was linear. Europeans represented the cutting edge of progress and human advancement, whereas the rest of Asia, Africa, Latin America represented the primitive past. This mythology can still be seen in U.S. exceptionalism, which deploys the rhetoric of good versus evil. I don't know if you remember the second Bush administration referring to the evil empire. Anyone remember that? It was good versus evil. And yeah, and it claimed to lead the way in the world to realizing the ideas of freedom and democracy. If the illusion of moral exceptionalism did not perish in Vietnam, it surely came to an inglorious end for those who followed what was happening in El Salvador. So I'd like to suggest just a few important historical highlights that took place prior and during the Civil War. First, I think it's important, and I've been urged to include this in the presentation for good reason, that the Salvadoran resistance to expropriation of communal lands and to domination by oligarchic interests happened long before the Civil War and before the Russian Revolution. And so I bring this up because it wasn't principally about foreign interest, the conflict that we're looking at that took place in El Salvador. In 1833, 6 years before independence, there was a rebellion led by Anastasio Aquino. He was defeated by the government forces, decapitated, and his head put on public display in a cage. There were also rebellions in 1872, 1875, 1885, 1898, and 1899. So there has been a history of resistance in El Salvador long before the Cold War. El Salvador has only recently had relatively stable democratic institutions. During the period 1850 to 1905, the nation was marked by coup after coup. And to put this in perspective, very briefly, there were 47 chiefs of state, but only 5 were able to finish their terms. The crash of 1929 impacted the oligarchs' coffee profits drastically, and it put the squeeze on labor, which was already under great pressure. By the 1930s, 60% of coffee production was controlled by 500 out of 10,000 producers. During the coffee crash, prices dropped 57%. The repression against peasants and workers intensified, and by 1931, national income was half of its 1928 level. I bring this up because of the all-important historical event in 1932, referred to as the Matanza, or the Great Massacre. The uprising in 1932, during the regime of Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez, was initiated by indigenous people and supported by the nascent Communist Party. The response of the government was to target anyone with indigenous features, as well as trade unionists, communists, peasants, and anyone suspected of sympathies with the ill-prepared rebellion. Between 10 and 30,000 persons were killed by the government forces. And now I skip to the 1960s. This is a crucial period. because this was the period when the US set up its military doctrine and practice in Central America. The US set up a security and intelligence network using the public safety programs. These were USAID sponsored programs. Washington provided support in internal security policy, planning, operations, and the reorganization of paramilitary forces. The idea was to nip any challenge to oligarchic interests in the bud. That is, prevent leftist inroads in the politics of the nation. By 1967, AID, Public Safety, established centralized communications between the National Guard, National Police, and Immigration Police. National Police Headquarters was a communications center and was linked to Orton. Now, Orton was a vast security network referred to sometimes in El Salvador as orejas, which stands for the ear, the ones listening. And they would report, and by the way, if you joined Orton, you were probably going to be able to get a job to support your family. So this was a fairly massive network that were the eyes and ears of the security forces and ultimately the central communications that collected the information. And this surveillance network and this security apparatus was linked to U.S. Southern Command. So this is very important for those interested to study this period of the 60s, because this is prior to any significant insurgency. This was preparatory. So instead of addressing the extreme economic inequality, what they were doing was preparing for future insurgency, future resistance. In addition to this preparation, the electoral paths to reform were closed. And so I bring up very briefly the 1972 broad-based opposition coalition of political parties, which ran a Christian Democrat, Jose Napoleon Duarte, as their candidate, and the election was stolen from them in an electoral fraud. 1977, an OAS mission reported on human rights abuses by the National Police and National Guard. The report, quote, contained case after case with victims' names of torture, brutality, and barbarity. In the National Guard barracks, the OAS team found torture equipment, secret cells, and some of them were 1 meter by 1 meter. The report documented the use of electric shock, suffocation, rape, and castration. In 1977, in the aftermath of another electoral fraud, several thousand UNO backers gathered in the Plaza Libertad, which means what? The Plaza of Liberty, where the soldiers opened fire on the gathering, killing about 200 people. And now I skip to 1979 because there was a very significant coup in 1979 that, and normally you hear the word coup, you think bad, okay? But actually, the coup of 1979 was very broad-based. It included more moderate sectors from the ruling class. It included moderate sectors on the left. It had the support of the Archbishop, I should say the blessing of the Archbishop, because a lot of the people involved in the coup went to him for their blessing. So you had reformists in the military asking for his blessing and people on the left asking for his blessing. And the Carter administration was well aware that this was going to take place. And this civilian military junta put together a really progressive reform program. What did this program include? Was an amnesty for political prisoners, a land reform, a reform of the armed forces, and one of the principal people behind this coup was a leader of what was called the Juventud Militar, the young military group, a reformist group within the military. Well, this quickly unraveled. Hardliners within the military basically took over the junta. The attorney general was murdered, and most of the civilians resigned, fled the country, ran for cover. and the country moved way to the right. If you could move further to the right. So there was a chance to avoid civil war. That's why I bring up the coup. And it's a time worth studying. In March 1980, March 24th, 1980, the Archbishop Oscar Romero was assassinated. And this is one of the things that drew worldwide attention, that something terrible must be going on in El Salvador if they could kill the Archbishop. What I mean by they, the intellectual author was Roberto de Buisson, who was in charge of security for the National Assembly and was still, had some close associations with the US Embassy. He was also an organizer of the death squads and a co-founder of the Arena Party. So, and the reason we know this was that Adolfo Mohana, who was the one behind that 1970 coup, had raided a farmhouse where the plot had taken place and was able to gather information about it. But what did we lose in Monsieur Romero? Not only a great human being, a beautiful human being, but he was someone who spoke, gave voice to the oppressed in El Salvador. That was his great crime. Because Catholic radio at the time, the radio station, was one of the few stations that were still on the air broadcasting the daily events of what was going on in the country. Also, the murder of Romero happens after the assassination of several priests. And the reason priests were being targeted was because there were growing Christian-based communities that sought to build a new world from below, from grassroots organizing in their communities. And probably the most infamous and well-known of the murders was Rutilio Grande, who was the priest in a town called Aguilares. And that probably contributed a lot to Romero's conversion. Another event that drew worldwide attention, but no change in US policy, was the rape and murder of 4 American churchwomen by National Guard soldiers commanded by Sergeant Luis Antonio Colindres Aleman. I give his full name because we should have those names stated again. And this took place on December 4th, 1980. They were abducted after leaving the airport. Now, US aid was briefly suspended by the Carter administration, and then it resumed just a few weeks later on December 17th, just in time for the transfer of power to the Reagan administration. And as you know, the Reagan administration basically said, we're going to draw the line in El Salvador. No negotiations with the FMLN, okay? And the idea was to destroy the FMLN and their support networks. So then Secretary of State Alexander Haig declared, and he was the incoming Secretary of State for the Reagan administration, quote, international terrorism will take the place of human rights in our concern. So that was an ominous forecast. And then we saw an intensification of the repression. Thousands were killed in San Salvador. And then we also saw the unification of the guerrilla organizations and the formation of the FMLN and their first offensive in January of that year when the Reagan administration came in. So the FMLN basically has its first coordinated attacks throughout the country against military targets. The US invested $1 million a day to build and support the security forces in a war of annihilation of the FMLN and their support base. Unlike Vietnam, there's not much forest area in El Salvador, since the support networks for the armed resistance was, as FPL Commander Cayetano Carpio said, the people. The army and death squad sought to, quote, drain the sea. In this case, in zones of FMLN control, and even in many cases beyond, collateral damage was not the exception, it was the rule. El Mozote, the Rio Sampo massacre, many other atrocities have marked the national psyche of El Salvador forever. What followed was another decade of democide and resistance until the United Nations, regional partners, and a more pragmatic Bush administration negotiated an end to the war in 1991. But I want to mention one other event which had a big impact on me, and I think in part helped bring an end to the war, and that was in 1989. There was another FMLN offensive, and the FMLN was able to take significant parts of the capital city, demonstrating their ability to continue the war if necessary. In other words, if there was not a negotiated solution. And in retaliation, the Atlacop Battalion, which was a rapid response battalion, went into the Catholic University, rounded up the faculty on campus, 6 Jesuit professors, shot them in the head, found their housekeeper and her 15-year-old daughter, murdered them too, and then put FMLN graffiti on the walls. And so most of these faculty were citizens of Spain, which is still seeking the extradition of all those responsible for this crime. It also, I believe, was one of the elements in consideration that it was time to end the war. It was time to end the war. Consideration by the Bush senior administration. So during the first 20 years after the signing of the peace accords, the right-wing Arena Party implemented neoliberal economic policies that not only kept a basic economic divide intact, but opened the country to privatization, dollarization, the selling of the national banks. El Salvador became an exporter of labor and an importer of remittances and food. And so now I'll skip to 20 years later, 2009. The first FMLN administration was elected. And one interesting thing to note was that in previous elections, various lawmakers would threaten the Salvadoran electorate. If you elect an FMLN candidate to the presidency, there's not going to be any remittances going into your country anymore. We're going to stop temporary protective status. I'm not saying this brought about the outcome of the elections, but it was clear interference. But in 2009, there was a statement, finally, because of pressure, I think, from the American people, especially from CISPIS and other solidarity organizations. The U.S. Embassy basically said, we're not going to interfere. Congressman Jim McGovern made this point very clear also. And the FMLN, the country elected its first FMLN to the executive branch in 2009. Mauricio Funes, who was actually a television personality, a newscast personality. So what happened with this first FMLN administration? You see a shift toward more social investment. For example, the Paquete Escolar provided school meals, uniforms, and school supplies. There was an increase in microcredits for small business, experiments with small agricultural production. And in 2014, we have the second FMLN administration elected, Sanchez Seren, who happens to have been an ex-guerrilla commander of the FPL, one of the guerrilla organizations that was within the FMLN. So what have we seen in these past now 26 years since the peace accords? We've seen an incorporation of the left into political life of the country. We've seen the building of democratic institutions. And we've seen, since the past 2 administrations, more and more social investment. But of course, we're all aware of the severe problems in terms of public security. The gang problem persists. There are stresses on the democratic institutions, especially the judicial branch of government. But nevertheless, politics now decides issues and disputes within the country, not violence and war. And that's a great step forward, I think, for El Salvador. But I want to say that it's not easy to make these points in the current political climate, but they must be made. An ahistorical perspective on El Salvador, I think we can observe, makes it all too easy to once again dehumanize the Salvadoran. And if we don't see ourselves, that is the complicity of the US government with democide in the past, will not understand the present flight of refugees from Central America, the pleas of the DACA recipients, which now could be undermined by present policy, and the anxiety of those now living in fear of ICE raids in our area as they surveil our neighborhoods. You've heard about surveillance of the 7-Elevens and right in our area. So this seriously reminds me of what was going on in the 80s. The Trump administration, playing to the tune of white supremacy and xenophobia, is beating the drums of hate against brown people from the global south, building a wall of ignorance and exclusion. Rather than seeing students, teachers, workers from all walks of life, the face of the Salvadoran is painted with tattoos in the national psyche. Never mentioned is the origin of the gang problem, or rarely mentioned, in the very war imposed by the US on the Pulgarcito, the tiny country of Central America. Over the past 3 years, thousands of children that have made their way to the US fleeing violence and intimidation in their barrios are part of the legacy of US policy towards Central America in the 80s, 90s, and even now in the first decades of the 21st century. So I know I'm in friendly territory here, but in other parts of the country, it's not so friendly. Montgomery County is a sister city to Morazan. Montgomery College has shown its friendship in forging people-to-people bonds with El Salvador, especially in the area of education. Tacoma Park declared sanctuary in the 80s for Salvadoran refugees and is still a sanctuary. So here at least we're building bridges and we're not building walls. So I mentioned we've been at this crossroad before. So I wanted to share just a little bit, another minute, about my experience during the 80s. When I was a graduate student in philosophy at American University, a group of us formed a Latin American, North American Solidarity Committee. And that was in response to both US intervention in El Salvador and an urgent humanitarian crisis right here in the DC area. Because we were aware of thousands of refugees coming in to especially the Adams Morgan and Mount Pleasant area. So what we did basically was started out with having forums on campus and discussion groups on campus. And then we started bringing food and clothing to the barrio. We called it the barrio. And then we became more aware that immigration raids were going on. So most of us moved into the neighborhood, dividing up into different houses where Salvadoran refugees were living. And I think what was, in hindsight, what I take to be an ethical, critical consciousness that we had, perhaps without knowing it, was that we didn't characterize the Salvadorans who we encountered as just victims. We saw them as protagonists because they were forming organizations, Crecen, Clínica del Pueblo, organizations of self-help for their people who were arriving. So we realized we couldn't characterize the other in any way. that we had to become aware of our so-called locus of interpretation. North Americans having the security of being citizens, etc. So we were engaged in a learning experience and a sharing experience with the growing Salvadoran diaspora. And we learned a great deal. And we also began to work together in resisting the deportations and in exposing what was going on in El Salvador. There's nothing like testimony from real people to open your eyes. There's nothing like listening to survivors to sensitize you if you know how to listen and you're receptive. So let's take questions or comments.
Yes, I was wondering, with the surveillance of the 7-Eleven, which has happened recently in this particular area, were the people who were being picked up people who had been hired by 7-Eleven, or were they people who were in the parking lots of 7-Eleven looking for work that was not associated with 7-Eleven?
Yeah, well, I read both, that they were looking at who 7-Eleven was employing, and also the fact that sometimes 7-Elevens are gathering points for day laborers. And so that would be a place that they could maybe find undocumented persons.
We have a lot of El Salvador students here, a lot from Central America. What's your sense of how they look at their home country? I mean, many of them, even though they lived here most of their lives, they have relatives there, maybe their grandmother is there, maybe a parent, and they probably go back there to visit, for weddings and other, religious events. How should we think about how they look at their own country or their home country? And I don't even know whether they would consider El Salvador their home country, even if they live there maybe 10 years. If they're here, immigrants tend to be assimilated, particularly young people, pretty quickly.
Yeah, wow, that's a very heavy question. Well, in the 80s, many of the Salvadoran refugees who arrived here referred to what was happening in their country as la situación. So they had internalized the trauma so much that some didn't want to speak about it, even though they were in a relatively more safe situation. So you had a Salvadoran leadership that did speak out, that were organizing, but then you also had a lot of people who were traumatized and even sometimes very difficult to reach out to. And so that's the generation, those are the parents we're talking about. And so I would say some of them, very proud of being a Salvadoran, identifying as a Salvadoran, have their kids learn the language and know their history. But I would contrast that with those who turn away from their heritage, want to identify more with being a resident of the US and appropriating whatever values associated with that, and even speaking English in the home. And so you also have young people that don't know the Spanish language. So I'd say it's a heterogeneous phenomenon and not discrete like that there were all gradations. But there is, in Salvadoran culture, a lot of importance of what's called historic memory. They call the historic memory is really important. And I think that cultural expressions, right, from artists and musicians are trying to inspire this generation to go back to their roots, to learn their history. Otherwise, they're not going to understand why the DACA recipients are under attack. And TPS is under attack.
Fred, you talked about the role that Oscar Romero and Rutilio Grande played as speaking out against what was going on in El Salvador. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the role of the Catholic Church and other established religious organizations, and I guess the transition from the Catholic Church traditionally being more aligned with the upper classes, the bureaucracy, and how that change came about in not only in El Salvador, but in other Central American countries around liberation theology.
Yeah, so liberation theology had some support from the Catholic Church, the Puebla document, the idea of a preferential option for the poor, and Gutierrez, Camilo Torres, Enrique Dussel, and others who were founders of the theology of liberation and later philosophy of liberation. The idea was that there's a community of human life, and whether from a religious or secular perspective, it's a universal value that we should all be able to live and develop in community. And to live and develop in community, advancing this by means of democratic procedures and doing it in a way that's feasible. And so Romero was actually selected as Archbishop under the understanding that he was somewhat a conservative character, even though he had been exposed to the theology of liberation at seminars held in Ecuador when he was a young man. He was, and the anticipation was he wasn't going to make waves. But the reason I mentioned he was converted, I didn't mean he was converted to become a Christian or a Catholic. He was converted to the preferential option to the poor by convivir, by living with his people, coming close and near to his people, and then suffering the murder of some of his closest associates, like Rutilio Grande. So you did have a division within the Catholic Church of a more conservative, don't make waves, and even perhaps some complicity with the oligarchic forces. And then you had Romero willing to take a stance, but knowing that he was becoming, with Levinas calls, a hostage. In other words, replacing the other, putting himself instead of the other as a symbol for the suffering other. So he actually, in some sense, anticipated that he himself would be a target. And the Carter administration, which was the Human Rights Administration, sent an emissary to the Vatican with the message to rein in Romero. And Romero sent a personal letter to President Carter begging him to stop the aid. And I believe it was Vance who responded to the letter. But you can look up both the letter from Archbishop Romero and the U.S. response to the letter. And he was killed not long after he made that appeal. And he was actually murdered days after he called on the armed forces to stop killing the people.
I want to thank you for your overview of the history of El Salvador, which is so complex. I'm originally from El Salvador. I'm an artist and an educator here in DC, and I'm also working on with a collection of art from the Civil War times and the post-war time. The project is called Laberinto Projects, and you may want to take a look online for some of the artwork that is part of this archive. And if any of you are interested in using some of these pieces for your for your courses, whatever it is that you would like to integrate into it, I'm working on creating some educational material and resources, and I'm looking for people who are interested in that particular way of thinking. I'm creating an exchange between the U.S. and El Salvador with a site. I've just taken a group of students from the University of Hartford, and I'm looking for other kinds of opportunities like that. And I'm just, telling you that, I've been working as an artist, dealing with issues of trauma and historical memory, and and to kind of point you also to the fact that all of this history is extremely nuanced, and how it is that we remember is also really important. That, you know, one book, for example, that would be really great is Remembering a Massacre, which talks about the 1932 massacre, but really about the processes of how we remember. It's by Hector Lindo and Eric Cheng and can't remember the third writer right now. But there's just like this whole idea that how it is that we remember even the events have influenced, you know, the whole history of El Salvador, which, you know, is also a very contested history. And for all of us who are here, you know, it's really important to try to find other ways that we can tell these stories coupled with our own personal stories. And I think that art is a great way of doing that. And so I'm just pitching it out there because it's, you know, like you are a captive audience, and I think that if you're interested in El Salvador, you will find these artists really interesting and important in telling the story about that time. And I've done a lot of outreach pieces that involve the community in trying to tell this story, their own stories through the artwork. So anyway, thank you.
Could you say your name, please?
Muriel Hasbun, Hasbun.
Be sure to wait around afterwards and chat with us. Don't leave. We're very interested in Salvadoran art. Yes. Oh, another question. Did you want to speak to that, or?
Only I'd also like to speak to you afterwards, because I know someone who's collected posters from during that period. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, again, thank you for coming. This is wonderful. When you were talking, I caught a couple of words, and I wanted to ask you. So one is, you said microfinance, and I wanted to know a little bit more of that. And also you said democratic institutions are springing up, and also you said social institutions. So what are those social institutions, and if you can talk a little bit about that?
Okay, so Microcredit, for example, in Morazan, I went and observed a microcredit program where women could start their own small production, for example, raising chickens and a certain amount of agricultural products. And by small, I mean family farming. And so by extending microcredit, it's also a way of building community and a sense of economic independence for a small producer. There's also ADESCOs, they're called. They're local community developed organizations, and I went and observed at Lacteos Morazan, and my son did a video documentation of this, where people who might have just 1 or 2 cows can bring their milk to this lactose processing plant, where very high quality milk and cheese is produced. And since it's a co-op, they can share in some of the profits. I also visited one of the longest standing coffee co-ops. And that's not microcredit, but it's an example where you have both building community and successful long-term production, and in this case of coffee. And then the second issue was?
The social institutions, you said. You said something about social institutions. So did you mean like when these people are coming into groups, that's the social institution?
Well, I was
microcredit or through like cooperatives?
Well, I think I referred to the democratic institutions that formed after the peace accords. And so I think El Salvador is extraordinary in this regard, because you have a national police force that's constituted by former enemies. You know, people from the armed forces and people from the guerrilla organizations. And I interviewed, I got to talk to a police officer. He said, well, the first year we were watching our backs. but now we're all brothers and sisters. We don't distinguish anymore and worry that, oh, he was a former this or she was a former member of that group. And then the National Assembly has been functional since the peace accords. And sometimes the FMLN would be able to build a coalition, form a majority, and then it would go back toward the right wing. But the biggest problems have been with the judicial branch. There are some people that claim it's been too heavily politicized over the past few years. But nevertheless, I think the big picture is the struggle is on a political level and not in terms of violence and golpismo. Although the people always have to be on guard, the grassroots and social organizations have to be on guard. So we could refer to social sectors as ecological sector, LGBTQ rights sector. These different sectors representing different interests have been effective in El Salvador. And for example, bringing an end to extractive mining operations. It's banned in El Salvador right now. And this has brought all parties into that fold. There's a struggle going on for the right to water in El Salvador. So social movements and organizations have an impact and put pressure on the political parties, which is a good thing. That's how democracy should work.
We just mentioned the thing about the police and the different factions coming together and the issues with the judicial branch. I'm vaguely familiar with the Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa. Could you talk a little bit about what the UN did and didn't do in El Salvador? It seems to me like there was some truth but not enough reconciliation, or there was a reconciliation and no truth. How did that play out?
I didn't mean to say that the institutions are without problems, because there are problems in the national police. There are problems in public security. But in terms of comparing South Africa to El Salvador, there weren't a series of hearings and confessions. And this has left a deep wound in the Salvadoran psyche that people are still feeling and struggling with. So an end to the impunity, the hearings and trials that are going on now hopefully will bring some closure. The trials that were held in Miami here, Juan Rumagoso and others found some measure of justice in the conviction and civil suits against some of the perpetrators, Vidas Casanova, Guillermo Garcia, and some of these notorious figures that were in the government at the time. But you didn't have the sort of confessions and sometimes forgiveness that we saw in South Africa. It didn't have that in El Salvador.
Why do you think that didn't happen?
Well, I think it's because the first post-war administration promulgated an amnesty, and you can call it a self-amnesty, if you will. There were exceptions, for example, the murder of Romero. There were exceptions to the amnesty, but it provided a kind of a blanket of impunity. And the it depends a lot on the Attorney General, judicial branch, whether there's going to be prosecutions. So I think it was the leverage of the oligarchic interests in the right-wing parties. They had enough political leverage to stop that sort of truth and reconciliation that we had in South Africa.
Another question?
I don't know that I have a question, Fred, but maybe after the comment you could, if you had any further comments, that would be great. I think what I want to say is I'm so excited for my colleagues to go to El Salvador. Marcia and Rita and I went in 2013, and some of what Fred is saying is reminding me of the spirit of innovation and that the people that we met with seem to have. There are many problems in El Salvador, but there's this great spirit of innovation and desire to thrive. That's a sense that I came away with. The other thing is just speaking about the historical memory and the importance of that. We saw it everywhere. The walls of the universities, there's poetry written out, walls painted depicting the murder of the students at UES. I can't remember what year was that. Anyway, do you remember, Evelyn? Okay. Anyway, but students who did not live through that time painted that wall. So there is this importance of knowing the history. I remember speaking to a woman. I was walking down the street in Morazan, and a woman and I started to speak, and somehow we started talking about the war and what she had lived through. And she said, "There's so much I want to say about it, but every time I think about it, I'm just traumatized." So the trauma of the war is alive and well in El Salvador as well. So it's a complex, we get a very whitewashed version of what El Salvador is and what the Salvadoran community is. So, colleagues, you're gonna see it's a very complex, wonderful place.
Yeah, I just want to say that we don't see all the beautiful things that youth are doing in El Salvador. There's a lot of youth groups who have taken their own initiative to add to the enrichment of their communities. I went to Cacaopera, which is, has the remnants of indigenous community, and a youth group, thanks to Evelyn, a youth group was there to receive me and take me around town. And at every school we visited, the kids knew this youth group. And the interactions were really beautiful to see. They played sports together and updated each other about their lives. And so there's a lot of positive things that are going on in El Salvador in terms of youth, but we only hear about the negative. We don't know about the large parts of the country that are beautiful, relatively safe to travel in. And if you only listen to the news about El Salvador here, you'd be terrified to visit the country. Mm-hmm. I'm happy to go back this year to visit El Salvador.
I want to share a recollection also from that particular trip. We met with a sort of an informal, formal women's group when we were there, and heard a lot of their stories. It's a women's empowerment group, and they were sharing about why education is important to them, why they look forward to getting an education that they never had an opportunity to get. We found out during the course of that meeting that many of them woke up at 3 or 4 in the morning and walked many miles through the mountains to come and meet with us that day, because there's no public transportation, there's poverty and not much private transportation, and walking for hours and hours to get anywhere in Morazan is not uncommon. The other thing that struck me was they brought food for us. They carried cooked food for us. I mean, these are women who have nothing. And we were just so humbled by their spirit. Still today, I mean, this is, I think, what the humanities can convey, what the arts can convey, that really give people a sense of whom we're talking about when we talk about Salvadorans. Great, great, giving, generous, strong spirit. That's remarkable. And I, too, am excited, as you are, to see our reactions when we meet with Salvadorans again, because we need that other piece of the equation. We need that other piece of the identity that we don't really see here very much. So Can I ask you a question now that's a little self-interested? I just mentioned the humanities. The global humanities, obviously, at the Institute and the NEH, believe that one way of promoting understanding, empathy, and true connectivity among peoples worldwide is through our art, our literature, our expressions of religion, our philosophies, history, all the really, really fundamental humanities. Could you speak just very, as long as you want, about how it is that the humanities can help in this necessary relationship building between us and El Salvador?
Wow. Well, I've had the opportunity to study over the past few years the work of Enrique Dussel, and he talks about precisely this, an intercultural world dialogue. And two concepts are critical to that dialogue. One is that we're trying to build a pluriversal world. So we're not going to say that there's one master morality or culture that would be the criteria against which we would measure other cultures. So the pluriversality is important. But then there's a universal component that the pluriverse will give us different expressions of, and that is that every culture wants their people to live and develop, to live and grow in community. So that's something universal. That's not something where we say, oh, we're going to impose this value. And in this process, in this intercultural dialogue, we can find the common themes, the core themes. What does it mean to be in the world? How can we complement each other's economies? So the world is not just a competitive relationships, but complementary relationships, and learn from each other that way. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'd like to speak to global humanities and their part in Montgomery College in bringing some awareness as a kind of set of first steps in terms of understanding the youth of El Salvador who are now displaced here. And I'm not sure if this name is right. I want to say Ricardo Rodriguez, a very young Salvadoran artist who lives here in the community. His work has been presented at a couple of events that are related to global humanities. Incredible art, Rafael Rodriguez. Yeah, a remarkable artist. And so that's opened up a whole new door, and maybe speaks to what Muriel has been to her project in terms of an extension of not just what's already happened, but what the youth have to say through their arts. And the other is a presentation by Gloria Bonilla, who coordinated high school students. I think it was the Carlos Rosario,
From DC?
Yes, from DC, that the high school students there, as an art project they were given, it was called Artist Books, and the students who were new to the U.S. and didn't speak English they were given the project of writing a book and illustrating it to demonstrate their own traumas and experiences in coming to the U.S., and then it was put on display in the nearby library here. Also, Reading, Writing, Language Center. And so those were, they're steps, but they're beginning to open up that world of what art and writing and all that beauty can contribute to our understanding.
Through, as I said, trying through the arts to also ignite this kind of environmental consciousness. Like right now, as part of Laberinto projects, we've built these open source plastic recycling machines, and are engaging the industrial designers and also the public to create, because what it does is that it recycles the plastic and then creates a raw material to create new products. And so We're doing a series of workshops with the designers and artists of El Salvador to, bring forth this new technology that is really an open source technology, but at the same time try to do it at the level of the community so that communities can realize some sort of potential, products that they can make also. So there's like little efforts like that exist, and of course, it's like you mentioned Ruta de las Flores, and there's some ecotourism, but El Salvador's is so small that every single piece of land is contested for growing or for some other thing. So it's difficult because of that, and it's been deforested quite a bit. But there are some efforts to actually try to plant some more trees.
Are there any more comments or questions?
Ask one question?
Yes.
This may be a final question, and maybe a bit of a downer. We're talking about tourism, but I think in the minds of probably your average American, even in Montgomery County, when they think of El Salvador, they think of the guys with the tattoos on their head, MS-13 gangs that are directing gangs here in our area. How should we look at the impact of the gangs in their, I was a little bit surprised to hear that it's a relatively safe country to travel in. I don't know much about El Salvador, but just what I read in the paper would suggest, wow, the gangs are controlling everything. Can you put this in a little perspective and give us some insights?
Yeah, the municipalities where the gangs have significant control. When you go to El Salvador, your counterparts in El Salvador know where those boundaries are. And for example, in Morazan, I travel throughout Morazan, I hop on the buses, and without that much concern myself. And when you first go into especially the small town in this region of the country, you become the grand spectacle for the first 15, 20 minutes. People checking you out, want to know who you are and what you're doing there. But then after a while, you sort of blend in somewhat and can enjoy the place, the beaches, again, relatively safe. So if you're with people who know the country and the territory, again, I would, bring my friends to El Salvador, and I'm really not that worried, but if you wander into Ciudad Delgado or Ilopango or something like that, and you have tattoos, yeah, you might be in trouble.
I guess I could add.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah. I want to say very quickly that we're using the travel agency that the county uses when they travel to El Salvador, so they kind of know the places to stay away from.
So I'm from El Salvador, and I have lived here for 36 years. But since I was able to travel when I became a resident of the U.S., a legal resident, and I have been able to travel, I go every year, even 2-3 times. And I can tell you the number of foreigners that are in El Salvador, even backpackers, that they are just with a few dollars in their pockets and they go everywhere. So I should say that there are some areas like, Mexicano, Soyapango, and unfortunately it is where the poor people live, the marginalized. Those are the affected by the gang. But you can go, we have, we have areas like Santa Tecla, or you feel like you are somewhere in Europe, or, so there are, most of the country you can travel, but you avoid, certain neighborhoods. So, and they are not exactly in the middle of the cities. They are like kind of marginalized. So you really have to go out of your way to get into those areas. But if you go, the main roads and the main cities, and you will never know that there, you will wonder what's going on, like what Shelley was saying. There is a lot of people are so interested in progressing, in living, and there is a lot of people, selling things in the street. So it's really, I mean, you gotta go. I invite you. I go every year.
But in looking at El Salvador, what we've discovered is we come back to this question of how are we implicated as individuals, as a country, in what has happened there and what is happening today. And as we're talking about dangerous areas, safe areas, poor areas, not so poor, I am thinking of Montgomery County. How many Upper County people would go to Langley Park? They would not drive there. Okay? It's dangerous. I live near there. I mean, we live near there. And it's perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine. But there are people who would not, who would never, ever, they hear of Langley Park and they freak out. They're like, not in my county, So, I mean, it's us also. When we look at the situation in El Salvador, the haves and have-nots, the dangerous areas, we are also looking at ourselves. This is a system we know very well. It's us. So thank you once again.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a million.
Appreciate it. Thank you.